Well, welcome everybody. We're really happy to have Maya Davis and Ms. Lewis, Gina Lewis, here with us today from Riversdale Museum. I'm Lisa Walker. This is the 10th and last edition of Corridor Conversations for 2024. We're an online series looking at the people and culture of Route 1. And we've had a number of people, a number of groups and people and things that we've highlighted over the last couple of years. And you can find those past sessions on our website. Corridor Conversations is a collaboration of other villages along Route 1, including Explorations on Aging. We have Marianne Hakes and Bonnie McClellan from Explorations on Aging with us today. We also include Helping Hands University Park and Neighbors Helping Neighbors College Park. We're really happy to have Maya Davis, the director of Riversdale House Museum, and her colleague Gina Lewis, the museum's Curatorial and Interpretation Specialist, with us today. Ms. Davis has a distinguished career as a research archivist at the Maryland State Archives, where she consulted on statewide projects, including the Adam Francis Plummer Portrait Commission, the installation of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman statues at the Maryland State House, the Annapolis Port Marker Project, which I noticed just the other day when I was in Annapolis, there at the right at the port, and the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Park and Visitor Center. She currently chairs the Maryland Commission on African American History and is a member of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Her colleague, Miss Lewis, has many years of museum experience in small historic houses and large-scale museums, most recently the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She is dedicated to uncovering and sharing stories through objects and material they left behind, especially stories from marginalized communities. Ms. Davis will begin, and she'll tell us of the project they have underway at Riversdale now to bring forward the lives of those enslaved who lived and toiled at Riversdale. And they were able to do this from the writing of Adam Francis Plummer, who was literate and left behind some writings. Welcome very much, Ms. Davis and Ms. Lewis. You can take it away now.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and then I'll start off and kind of give like a general overview, and then I'll let Gina take it away because she's going to focus on some of the holiday tradition things that we've been doing around Riversdale, as well as the other interpretive work that we've been doing. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'll just see if you are able to see it. If you can just let me know. Are you able to see?
I can see it, yeah.
Okay. All right, and then let me just start the slideshow. Okay, and so is everyone good now?
I can see it, yeah.
Okay,
good.
So I'm going to go in and just at least first try to orient everyone with Riversdale. We are a National Historic Landmark and a National Park Service Network to Freedom designated site, meaning that we do have a connection with stories related to the Underground Railroad, or the Flight to Freedom, as it's better known today. We are trying to really define and get people to really engage with us and think of us as a campus and not just one singular mansion house, so that it feels more inclusive and people think about, the full breadth of what we are. So of course we have the historic mansion house, which was constructed between 1801 to 1807. And we have our visitor center, which is usually the first place that people come when they come to Riversdale, because while the mansion isn't open every single day, it's open during tour hours, and people are only able to access it during tour hours or public programs. Our visitor center is open almost every day. And then we have our dependency building, which is a 19th century building dating to about 1853. That is the second dependency building there, where there would have been cooking there. There would have been a number of people who lived there over time. We've been often asked, is this a slave quarter? It is not one of our 9 documented slave quarters that we know of, which is like near where the uh, College Park Academy is today. We know, though, that this was a dwelling that would have housed different people that worked at the site, including free laborers and enslaved individuals. So this isn't like a self-defined slave cabin in the traditional sense. And then we also have our interpretive garden, which we are doing a lot of work now, which I'll kind of show you later on, to really do a lot of interpretation around it, because we have a lot of things growing there, but there wasn't a lot of signage. We have one sign at each quarter of the garden, but we're going to be doing a lot of work in the next couple of months to years to get more interpretive signage to kind of describe what you're seeing and about the history, because we typically get a lot of people who walk through our grounds while we're there, even after we're there, and we really want to have an opportunity to engage with visitors to the grounds and let them know more about the history of the site beyond, what our actual visitor is. So, as Lisa shared with you, the one thing I'll say is that we are very document rich, and we are very fortunate as a site to have as many documents that we do. But we have started, like the majority of our interpretation over the years had been focused on publication, The Mistress of Riversdale, the plantation letters of Rosalie Steer Calvert. And these were letters that she wrote to her family members, her father, her brother, who actually, her father actually started Riversdale, and during its earliest construction, when he moved his family from Annapolis to Riversdale, he was here for a couple of years before returning to their home in Antwerp, what is modern-day Belgium. So having these letters have been a great treasure trove, and we really are so fortunate that we had this perspective. But we realized, like we also have other perspectives that we need to think about. Rosalie was a wife. She was a mother who gave birth to 9 children, but was also a property owner who held enslaved people in bondage at Riversdale. And we're really fortunate to have the letters, the diary of Adam Francis Plummer, who was an enslaved person that came through the lineage of her husband, George Calvert. And so I'll move forward with this slide. And what I find so unique is that we have these 2 perspectives from both Rosalie as an enslaved owner, and then we have the perspective of Adam Francis Plummer. But I do want to clearly state that their paths never really crossed at Riversdale. It's not to say that they never met, but Adam came to Riversdale when he was about 10 years old in 1829, and Rosalie had already been deceased since 1821. So, it's just a different time period, but it does give us like 2 different perspectives, not just from, him being enslaved and her being the owner of the home, but then also like different eras. Like over time, people change and circumstances change. And so it's just really nice to kind of have that there. In the top corner, you'll see Adam, his wife, Emily Saunders Plummer, and she was enslaved at another property called Three Sisters. And I include her here because he kept his journal from the day that he married her, which makes me feel that she's a very important and integral part of this experience and the fortune that we have in like having their diary. And this diary is actually not owned by us, as like the letters of Rosalie are also not owned by us. They are actually still sitting in the family headquarters at Chateau du Mic in Belgium. But the diary itself is owned by the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum, which digitized the diary, and we're really fortunate to have that at our hands, to be able to kind of tell this full story. As we bring it forward from there, Rosalie Calvert's son, Charles Benedict Calvert, actually also kept private records, some of which are now on loan to us. And we've been able to kind of make sense of what we're learning through Rosalie's letters to her father Adam's diary, where he's keeping names of people. Like in Rosalie's letters, only a few of the 14 enslaved individuals, approximately like 7 to 9 of them, I think she names, and others are just in reference. So by having Adam's diary and Charles Benedict Calvert's papers, we now know some of the names of some of these other individuals, as well as other government records that we have, because after Rosalie passes away, a lot of her material actually is held in trust for her sons, through her husband. And her husband does not die until 1838 and keeps a lot of, you can find him not necessarily private papers, but in the public record, in things like assessment records. In 1832, there was a census that was taken of free Negroes, but then also an assessment of enslaved individuals. And this was following the Nat Turner Rebellion in Northampton, Virginia. So, like it's really an exciting time for us to be able to kind of merge together this information and think about what the future looks like for interpretation at Riversdale. Take it to another set of documents. Adam's daughter, actually in the 1920s, published her own book based on the oral histories shared with her from different family members, including her father, Adam Francis Plummer. So as I shared with you very early on, we are very document rich and very fortunate that our friends group, the Riversdale Historical Society, has done a very heavy lift in collecting a lot of the furnishings and material culture related to the Steer and Calvert family, and they've been very supportive in the museum's work to try to fill in the gaps and the nodes of erasure that you see just by way of enslaved material culture not really living on, or like an example of Adam Francis Plummer's, like being donated to a museum that's specific to African American history and culture, and trying to help us merge back that information so that we tell a collective story and that we don't prioritize any one over the other. So it has been really awesome to do that. This is, some of the images that I wanted you to see. Nellie Plummer, who you see here at the bottom, just referenced her book, Out of the Depths, which is published in the 1920s. And what I love about her book is, for the first time, like, she's giving a lot of the surnames that were here, and there were 13 that we knew of, and we are using that to kind of help us reconnect with descendants. And on the right, you see some of the papers of Charles Benedict Calvert, and you get an inside glimpse of like how they, like the conditions in which they were in when the Riversdale Historical Society really essentially kind of saved them, along with a family member who actually brought them to the society in hopes that they could help preserve these papers. So we're really delighted about that. As a whole, the work that we're doing is something that I think I would say that Riversdale and PG Parks, we really were taking the lead on it, but it became one of those things that our division realized we shouldn't be working in a silo, that this would be something that is really good for all of our historic homes. And we started with an NHRD, which is the Natural and Historic Resources Division Impact Planning Framework, so that we can start to think about, like, how do we impact people? So what they want is visitors experience and value NHRD's nature and historic sites, and choose to nurture and advocate for them so current and future generations come to know the joy and significance of outdoor recreation, natural resources, historical complexity, and cultural relevance. The one slide that I don't have here, just because I'm just trying to not dump too much down your throat, is that we recently also had an external audit of our interpretation, which is something that was driven so that we could look at working towards being more inclusive around in the story of enslavement. This is specifically around the story of enslavement and filling in those gaps, because as you can imagine, Riversdale has a very rich history, which I've just shared how much content we have. Like hundreds of years, but a lot of that has centered the Steer and Calvert family. And we will continue to share those stories, but we have a heavy lift to kind of bring a level of balance in the stories that we're telling, to make sure we bring in those other voices that we don't know of, who are the other Adam Francis plumbers and Emily Saunder plumbers who live and work at Riversdale. And so we just received our report back, and we'll be going towards an implementation meeting in December. So you'll start to see more changes over time in the coming year to 5 years. And I should say, with the impact planning framework, we do have 3 defined groups in which we are slated to focus on, and that's school communities, hesitant communities, and communities that want to make a change. So that last one giving a nod to social justice. So as I shared, one of the things I think we are really fortunate with is that we have such a rich connection with our descendants, and we have developed a Riversdale Descendants Network. And so we've been able to reconnect with a variety of members from the Calvert family and the Plummer family, some of whom have been to Riversdale and have been engaged in various levels, but then there's others who had never been to Riversdale, and it's really been excited to see them come through, and they learn about us through social media, which Gina Lewis for a number of years has really honed in on our social media from the Peachy Park side, but then our Riversdale Historical Society also has a website in which they promote the work that we do. So we've been able to have people learn about us more and more through those channels and come through. And I'll show you like some of the things that we have had as outcomes as a result of descendant engagement. On the left is the original portrait of George Calvert that as an older person. We have a copy of the younger portrait that's at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, but this older portrait actually sits in the private hands of a Calvert descendant who had not been to Riversdale before, and she came to visit us for a tour and actually is having a copy made for us, which will be donated to the museum, and is close to being finished and will probably come in 2025. And then on the right, having an image shared with us of the oldest living descendants of the Plummer family, who are 99, 102, and 104. So we're making small inroads, but this is the power of connecting with descendants. We continue to learn about different things that are still out there in their collection that help us to engage the public and learn about a 19th century Chesapeake Bay family. I mean, this is really a very Maryland-centered story, but it's also a very global story as we start to think about the Steers and Calverts being European from Belgium, and then also thinking about the Plumbers and being here generationally, but having a background in the transatlantic slave trade and the impacts of Africanness on this culture. Some of the other small things that we've done is we have come up with vignettes about some of the enslaved. Gina Lewis, who you'll meet in a few, she actually was took the lead on building out these vignettes for enslaved voices that were typically not really highlighted in our typical tour. And we put them out in stanchion text so that people could learn about the enslaved workers at Riversdale. And then we also had a project that Gina and I worked on to do a photo shoot of descendants of the Plummer family to actually portray some of these individuals that we're learning about, like Lucy and Sarah and Will Scott the coachman. It's been a very wonderful project, and this is the butter churn, the girls at butter churn. This is one of the samples, and we have temporary silhouettes in place right now, and our Baltic birch permanent silhouette should be arriving pretty soon in a couple of weeks. The other material culture, things like the Tucker porcelain that you see here on the screen. This is something where we're starting to think about, like, how do we show duality in the objects that we do have in place of not having a lot of the material culture related to the enslaved population. So, the Tucker porcelain we know was purchased by Charles Benedict Calvert and was used by him during times when he actually entertained at the home and had family time. But this is a set that also has to be cleaned and cared for. And so we're thinking about the perspective of enslaved workers as they are in the house, and we know at least 14 of them working in the house regularly. So, we really are rethinking how we do that. We have also commissioned a portrait of Adam Francis Plummer for our collection because, while it's great to be able to get reproductions and things like that from other museums, we wanted to have something that was our own. And so the artist Chanel Compton actually created this mosaic for us of Adam Francis Plummer, which will become a part of a permanent exhibition that we're currently working on the enslaved workforce, which will be in the east wing of the house. And we just had our kickoff meeting the other day for our design phase of that exhibition. So we're really excited to see this come to fruition. And we had an unveiling for this particular event, which was featuring members of the public and the Plummer family. Our historic site garden, which I mentioned to you earlier, we have been very intentional about what we're doing here, and we've plotted out how we are going to grow in this garden, and this is going to help us drive the information that we put into the interpretation. So you can see in the top left, we have a children's garden, and that's a space that's intended for children, school children, to come and grow and learn about growth and be able to touch and feel things, because children really do like to see, feel, and touch and use their sensory experiences. We also have the indigenous plant garden, the native plant garden, for things that we're actually growing here and thinking about, like foraging for indigenous communities. And this particular plot happens to be in an area where we were receiving a lot of water runoff, and it typically would have killed any other plants living in that plot. And so having native plants and telling our public about the importance of native plants and how they're used both in foraging and for medicinal purposes, it's a great opportunity to educate as well. And on the second from the left at the top is the enslaved workers garden, where we're going to talk about the experience of the enslaved, think about the merger of cultures in terms of food preparation and growth. And beneath that is the indigenous garden. And that's our nod to acknowledging that the land in which we sit on was once land belonging to indigenous communities such as the Piscataway. And while it may not have been a traditional homestead, it was land that belonged to the Piscataway, and we just want to acknowledge that. And so we have worked with different Piscataway leaders over the years to get their perspective on like what should be grown in that plot and how it's grown. And so there's corn, beans, squash, the traditional indigenous crops, but things like sunflowers as well. And so it is a really unique garden where we kind of do a merger of both plants and vegetation all in the same plots. And the plots to the right of that, we are going to have a plot that focuses on the ornamentation garden that Rosalie Steer Calvert kept when she was there. And then in front of that is that of her son, Charles Benedict Calvert, who is considered a father of agriculture here at Maryland, and talk about agricultural practice and some of his ideals. And, it's just really a great way for us to show that we really are dedicated to being inclusive and that we're not looking to erase anyone's story or prioritize one over the other, but making sure that there's a balance when people are coming here to learn and that all voices are uplifted as they're here. In the other two gardens, we grow things like tulips and things like that, and there is signage. The president of our Friends group, he and his brother gave a large donation towards establishing this garden. And so we really wanted to recognize them for that. And what they decided is that instead of having themselves be recognized, that they would like to honor their mother, Betty Gossett. And so the very first plot, which you see is A towards the bottom, because in terms of orientation, as you walk into Riversdale, you will be walking closer to the plots that are listed here on the bottom of your screen. But Betty Gossett, there is a memorial tribute to her in the first plot. So it'll be a lot to learn, and a lot will be changing throughout the year. We do collaborate with different groups. At the top, you can see two chefs that came to support one of our programs, Echoes of the Enslaved in the past, and they actually use food from our gardens to do cooking demonstrations and provide samples for the public at that program. And then at the bottom, artist Felicia G. actually came and at the end of our season, when our plants were dying out, she actually used them as a part of an installation that she did about Black midwifery. And so it was really interesting to see like how people utilize items from our site to continue to tell different stories. And so it was really helpful. And so it's great that we do this. And then our primary use for these gardens is cooking. Our 19th century kitchen guild actually cooks for us about 2 Sundays a month. They are coming towards the close of the year, so I implore you to come out and see what they're doing. They'll be cooking for the final time in December when we do our holiday program, Riversdale by Candlelight. But we find that this is a great way to connect with the community, as we recognize that is the best way that people connect is over and around food. And so we do the 19th century demonstrations. Then when we have extra, we put it out and share it with the public. So now I will turn it over to Gina so she can kind of talk about some of the holiday traditions. And Gina, if you need me to move forward in any way, just let me know. I'll make sure that I'm moving the slides forward.
Great. I will probably just say slide and you can switch over to the next one.
Okay.
Let me get myself set up. Okay. So thank you, Maya, for giving us the macro. I'm going to take a little bit of time here to do the micro and to really walk us through how we take those very intentional steps to make sure that both all voices are being heard. What does that look like? You have seen some examples of silhouettes that we've placed in the room. You've seen examples of how we are switching up the interpretive signage that we have in the rooms themselves on the stanchions. And I'm going to walk you through how we do that specifically with food and how we do that with food around the holidays, since that is around the corner and that's what's coming up. And I think many of us will be indulging in a lot of these delicious things this coming week, in fact. So I'm going to set the scene for you a little bit first. We have a few letters. Rosalie was writing back to her family in Antwerp, and Maya mentioned that these letters are just a wealth of knowledge. When they were discovered, they were really used as the major primary interpretive material for creating the museum, which opened in 1993. So here's a couple quotes. There's one from 1804. She's writing to her mother. And she says, "You asked me how I amused myself. During the winter, I frequently went to parties in Washington. I also took up dancing again. For the last 2 months, I had 2 Miss Stewarts here and Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Lewis for a few days." The next slide, please. Another quote we have from 1819 is Rosalie writing to her sister. "The social scene in Washington is quite sparkling this winter. We have been to 3 very splendid private balls, one at Taylor's, the other at Mr. Baggett's and Mr. de Neuville's. Here at Riversdale, we have had 2 dinners, and we are planning a fine luncheon where there will be dancing. At these elegant dinners, we sit down to dinner at 5 o'clock. And this last quote could almost read as a text message that I send to my sister these days. Next slide. "The fact is that I have more work than I can do. My husband takes care of nothing. I must manage everything, the wine, provisions, everything. When we entertain, Mr. C does nothing whatsoever. All the trouble, all the arrangements fall on me." Sound familiar? Well, 2 things. One, not entirely for myself, in the sense that my husband takes his fair share of the housework, but also without context, we can't quite fully understand what Rosalie means by manage everything, quote unquote. As Maya mentioned, by 1819, Rosalie's household consisted of herself, her husband, 8 children, and approximately 14 enslaved men, women, and children laboring in the house itself. That does not include the enslaved individuals that were working outside the home on the plantation. So which means that we have a dramatically different understanding of what, quote, arrangements Rosalie was doing herself. And as Maya mentioned, at Riversdale, we strive to make our interpretation of the house as comprehensive and accurate as possible. That means honoring the voices and experiences of historically marginalized people, like the enslaved community, and humanizing people of the past to bridge them with the present. None of the opulence visible in the house was possible without the money generated from the labor of enslaved men and women. That means hearing Rosalie's words and listening for how they impact those who don't have a voice, didn't have space to share, and weren't given a place in history books. So what does this look like in practice? As I mentioned, I'm going to share how food and eating can be a universal language and a way for visitors to gain new perspectives on the past. I'm going to take one brief pause. I know we have a couple questions in the chat here, which I think I can probably answer pretty quickly. We were talking about that one document in the very beginning, and you might have seen a list of names like Moses and Elias. That was a list of enslaved that was specifically owned by Mr. Crampton, who through marriage was related to George Calvert, who was managing his property. So technically then owned by George Calvert. I believe that was what that first document was. And then, do you know how many enslaved people lived there? So our interpretation, as Maya mentioned, spans from 1801, when we're under Rosalie and George's ownership, then through their son when he takes over, all the way up to 1864 emancipation. So these numbers vary. And while we use things like census records, the daybook entries, slave schedules, that number kind of goes up and down, as well as, of course, letters. We know that an 1850 was probably the height of the number of individuals enslaved at Riversdale, which is about 55. And that speaks to how large was the original plantation and how much of the land still exists at Riversdale. A very small portion. Maya, I don't know how many, 1 acre, 4 acres? What's our current?
Yeah, I think it's 7 is what we are currently. And then, yeah, but in terms of the number, I would just say it's just so hard to say, but I would say that upwards of 100 over time. Just as we kind of look at it. But like one of our biggest challenges is that for those where we don't have a surname, some people have the same names, and just trying to make sure that we're identifying like one to one in terms of people and population.
Right. And originally the plantation size was, I think, about 1,200 acres, and then eventually, by the time it got to ownership under Charles Benedict Calvert, their son, was about 2,000 acres, and that obviously is very, very large and covers the area up at University of Maryland. As Maya mentioned, we have connections with the University of Maryland in the sense that Charles Benedict Calvert donated a portion of the land to start the creation of Maryland College of Agriculture, which then turned into University of Maryland. So about 2,000, I think, as largest. So if we do the next slide, I'm going to dig in here into some of these ways that we do this interpretation. Joyce White, who's our foodways historian, she creates tablescapes in our dining room, and I'm going to share a couple examples that we've done in the past. You saw those earlier slides of tablescapes of holiday meals, of course, with the candelabra and the turkeys and everything. One that she recently did over the past few years was called The Work Behind Christmas Merriment. And here she created a tablescape scenario that represents the type of tasks that Riversdale enslaved house servants may have been required to complete after dinner party. So not only are you walking into our dining room and seeing some food that would have been eaten, and you can imagine these parties that Rosalie's talking about, of how they sat down at 5 o'clock, and obviously wintertime, it's getting dark around here at 5 o'clock. It's going to be lit by candlelight, and I'm sure it was absolutely gorgeous. But what goes into this event happening for the white enslavers hosting their parties? There is loads and loads of work. And this is work by the enslaved community that lived and worked at Riversdale. So on the top left, you'll see Reproduction Commonplace book. The housekeeper basically records menus, does meal planning. There's table arrangements oftentimes in these commonplace books. And this would have been shared between probably Rosalie and the head housekeeper, which at times was a white woman who was hired, at times was an enslaved Black man. We don't have names for those individuals, but we know that it changes over time. And the bottom right, you're going to see a reproduction cellar book, a quill pen, wine bottles placed on top of the wine cellarette, and the wine decanter then is on the dining room table. So this shows that even just for the wine itself, there's a cellar in the basement where there's wine bottles. The wine bottles are then obviously listed and labeled in this reproduction cellar booklet, and the choices are made as to what's going to be served. They're brought upstairs and put into the cellarette, which is sort of a cooler, if you will, in that ice was placed on the bottom, and then wine bottles could be placed inside of it. And that then was decanted into beautiful glass decanters that would have been on the dining room or on the sideboard. So that's one part of the scene. Next slide. In the top left, you'll see that there's trays for clearing the dining room table after the meal has been eaten. So there's food that's half eaten. There's we have, dessert plates and platters holding fragments of food. And then everything is going to be loaded onto the butler's tray for removal to the butler's pantry, which is across the hall, and that is where items will be cleaned. We do not have running water, obviously, at this time in the early 19th century to be cleaning things, so there will be buckets of water and rags and cloths to be cleaning a delicate material, glassware and ceramics. The top right, you see dirty glassware that also would have been carried and brought over to the butler's pantry. And at the bottom, you see the rolled up crumb cloth, which would be shaken outside. And this was pretty universal. You've got this beautiful rug, this textile that you've paid a lot of money for, and you're not wanting crumbs and stains, and so this would have been laid out underneath. But this is not Rosalie folding this up herself. I have a small child who eats in a high chair, and let me tell you, the amount of crumbs that happen. We also have a crumb cloth, and it's so useful and so helpful, but it is me, myself, who is taking it up after every meal and shaking it outside for the squirrels to feast on. But of course, this would have been enslaved men and women rolling this up and shaking this out and then placing it out for the next meal. Next slide. On the left, you will see that there is spot cleaning happening for table linens. So of course you have tablecloths and napkins and things like that. In order to spot clean them, you're going to have glass bottles filled with a spot removal compound, glass bottles filled with water. You've got your old saucer. You've got your linen cleaning cloth, the material that's going to be good for clearing things out of linen material. And on the right, you have the forks and other types of cutlery that would be cleaned by rubbing them through sand, which is, of course, a mild abrasive, and that is placed in this box that's designed for this special purpose. So while you see these beautiful objects and items on the table, there is loads of material culture that is behind the scenes as well. So people don't save things like boxes full of sand to clean forks, but this is part of the in and out of everyday life. And then I think the next slide, top left, you see that there's going to be cleaning of the actual wood tables themselves. You can see that there's a bottle of a milk-based furniture cleaner and wool flannel cloths, and usually a linseed oil that would have helped to clean the tables as well. And on the right, this is a supper for the enslaved servants. So it is not commonplace that the enslaved servants would eat leftovers of the enslavers' lavish meals. This was not common practice, nor was it something that was a special opportunity or anything like that. These meals were simple meals, and they were typically eaten separately, of course, in either the kitchen area or outside. And these consisted of black-eyed peas with salt pork, greens, bacon, hominy, and corn cakes as well. Those are some of the items, and cabbage that you can see in that image. So our next slide here, we have Christmas dinner with the Plumbers in 1864. Here, Joyce showcases the types of food, cookware, and or serviceware that was owned by Emily Saunders Plummer, the wife of Adam Francis Plummer, who was enslaved at Riversdale until emancipation. And this fictionally depicts Christmas dinner in 1864, the Plumbers' first family Christmas in freedom. But it's created using historical documents. So we're using inventories and letters and things like that. Of course, the Plumbers would never have eaten in the Calvert's formal dining room. However, by displaying their meal in the main house, the importance and equality of all people who lived and worked at Riversdale, enslaved or free, is recognized. This is a very conscious decision that we made to show what this meal would have looked like in the Calvert's dining room. So some of the things you'll see, next slide. You can see that there's a ham. Adam raised hogs at Riversdale when he was a foreman. There were certain animals, chickens and hogs, that he owned as well, that he was able to raise while still being enslaved. And then once he was emancipated and paid to still work there as a foreman, he continued. So you see ham there. There's kidney stew. And this meal was very popular in the 19th century Maryland. It consists of lamb, veal kidneys, onions, claret wine, and was often served over waffles. It was often eaten for breakfast, but was also enjoyed other times of the year, such as Christmas. Of course, there's some garden produce. I think the green there and the bottom left in that plate is cabbage. So spicy mince stuffed cabbage. Cabbage was commonly grown in winter in Maryland, and African Americans introduced hot, spicy cayenne pepper to Maryland's cuisine. And we have green bean, carrot. We have green beans. Yes, that's right. Carrot and onion pickles. We know that there is a pickle dish in the inventory, and that Emily Saunders owned. And we also have I think some potatoes. And while enslaved, Adam was able to grow market produce to sell. And when he was freed, he continued to grow produce and sell it at market as well. We also have hot rolls. After abolition, many African Americans served hot yeast-risen wheat rolls for special occasions. And this was food that was denied to them when they were in enslavement. And cornbread was typically consumed during prior to 1864. And then at the top of the screen, you can barely see, but that is a Christmas plum pudding. And there's also some oranges as well. In 1852, Adam Plummer gifted his mother flour and sugar, two ingredients used in plum puddings. So this is perhaps one of those things that they would have had. So the point of showing these two meals laid out here is so that you can understand that our interpretation is really, as Maya said, how do we show that duality? This is how we show it. We make conscious decisions to put the plumber's meal on display, as well as show all of the work that would have been gone on behind the scenes for one of these parties that Rosalie mentions in her letters. The next slide. We have, how does this show up in our programming? So we have Riversdale by Candlelight that we do, and it's a program where the house is decorated in, holiday fare and greenery, and you walk through the house on self-guided tours, and you can view the house by candlelight. So while we serve things like Shrewsbury cakes, which you'll see on the left of your screen, that would have been a popular Calvert family item to have during the holiday season. We also are serving things like the ginger cake, which you see on the right. And that's a ginger cake specifically to bring up the story of how Frederick Douglass received a ginger cake from his mother once. So he was separated from his mother, Harriet, when he was young, and he was brought to Wyatt Plantation, which is on the eastern shore of Maryland. He lived there while he was enslaved, and his mother, Harriet, visited and at one point gave Frederick a ginger cake to ease his hunger. She noticed that he was not well nourished. And Douglass remembered this episode with love and gratitude and wrote, quote, "That night I learned the fact that I was not only a child, but somebody's child. The sweet cake my mother gave me was in the shape of a heart with a rich, dark ring glazed upon the edge of it." So while we are, showing these scenes in the dining room, and we've got our silhouettes that we are putting up throughout the house, even the food that you're eating as you come through the house during one of our programming is very intentionally chosen to show the array of what people would have been eating and not having access to as well. Next slide. We also have our Kitchen Guild, as Maya mentioned, and they do open hearth cooking demonstrations. And so for programs like Riversdale by Candlelight, they help us out by cooking different recipes. Some of the recipes they cook are things like speculoos. And this was definitely a Calvert family tradition. So we have a spiced short crust biscuit, and it's traditionally baked around St. Nicholas's feast day in early December, and was probably eaten by the Calvert family and thus made by enslaved cooks at Riversdale, one of which we know his name was Sam. He was enslaved in the early 19th century. And here is one of the recipes that the Kitchen Guild uses directly. And this is pound down 1/2 pound of butter, 4 ounces of brown sugar, 3.5 ounces of butter, pinch of nutmeg, and the same of mace, and cinnamon in powder, and then bicarbonate of soda. You make the paste into a ball, you leave it, and you can either press it into a mold. As you can see here, this is the shape of St. Nicholas himself, or some stars, or you can cut it into different shapes and cook them. So you could come to our Riversdale by Candlelight and see the Kitchen Guild making some things. I don't know if they're making speculoos this year. We don't have their recipes yet, but they may be. And then next slide. Another recipe would be Christmas plum pudding. And I mentioned that this was perhaps on the plumber's dinner table. And here I have a recipe for you all in case anyone wants to screenshot this and make this year at home. This is the modern recipe adaptation, so I'm not making you do 4 pounds of butter or lard. It's narrowed down to a very oh, see, I already see someone with their camera taking a picture. That's perfect. This is something that's very doable. And this recipe is from Joyce White, our food waste historian. So this can also be found on her website, and I can put that in the chat. So here's just another example. And so the reason I bring all these up is because these food-based examples are a few ways that we are balancing this narrative Riversdale and balancing the interpreted landscape. So not just the narrative, but what it looks like as well. And as Maya mentioned, we're currently working with a design firm to plan out the layout of a new permanent exhibition of the enslaved community. And then we'll be applying for a grant for the fabrication of the exhibit. So hold your breath, it's not around the corner, but it is in the works, which we're very excited about. And my last slide here is that on December 14th, we have Riversdale by Candlelight from 5 to 8 p.m. and that's $5. And then we also have Riversdale Holiday Traditions. That's 10 a.m. to noon, and that is our kid-centered program. So if you have any children in your lives, please bring them along. Kids are 5, adults are 3, and more info is at pgparks.com. And I see a few questions here. Would the plates and cutlery be plumbers? We know that we very specifically chose, instead of the Tucker porcelain that was owned by the Calverts, we chose a blue and white ceramic, which was a lower quality. Sounds negative. It's more of just, it's our version of the china versus the everyday wear. A blue and white ceramic would have been imported and much less expensive, and was on Emily Saunders' plumber's inventory. So we do know that she owned blue and white plates. So that's why we specifically chose those. And cutlery would have not been actual silver, but a very basic metal that would have been used for the cutlery. And what is the cookie to the left of the ginger cakes? And what are the ingredients? The cookie to the left of the ginger cakes, I quickly mentioned, is a Shrewsbury cake. And that recipe, well, what are the ingredients? It's very, very basic. It's basically like a sugar cookie. I can look that up if anybody's very interested, but I do believe that's probably on Joyce White's website as well. So I will put that link to her website in the chat.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you everybody for joining us as we talked about Riversdale. I'm going to stop sharing in case anyone has any additional questions that weren't in the chat, and come back to the screen. Thank you so much, Gina. That was awesome.
That was just great. I'm curious, you mentioned several times 13 or 14 enslaved people. I don't know if that's at different times or over the whole period of time. And do you have names for each one of them? And will you be able, do you have a profile, do you think, of each one of them like you did of, was it the one?
Was it
one
Lucy?
woman?
So Lucy would have been one of the 14, and we don't have all of the names, but Will Scott, who was the coachman, we know him. Sarah, who was a maid. Sam, who was the cook at Riversdale. So we do have their names. We have so many names that we're working with and really just trying to think about the different, and when we say 13 to 14, that's over time. It doesn't mean they were the same. What we do know is that I think Will Scott, he actually passes away by 1804. Is it, Gina? It's about that time. And so
it's actually a little bit later than that.
So, like someone else would have been the coachman after that. And so we're like continuing to uncover as we work on this exhibit right now and just getting those different stories. And then also just thinking that's just for the house. That's not the people who work on the grounds or in other spaces. The dependency is one of the only surviving, it is the only surviving outbuilding that's still at Riversdale. It doesn't account for some of the other spaces where we know people would have lived and worked. And then from a perspective of, like, people are hired in and out. We know that in Charles Benedict Calvert's papers, we've seen the mother of Mary Surratt hire out a number of enslaved people to work at Riversdale. So we're really trying to do our due justice and trying to figure out like how we put on display the people who worked at Riversdale and kind of help everyone know where that was.
And a little bit about how we kind of get to this point in terms of names. We've mentioned lots of different types of documents. So, Rosalie may mention a Betty in 1803. Then Betty's daughter is mentioned, but we don't know if that's the same Betty in 1817. Then, as Maya had said, while Adam and Rosalie's stories don't necessarily line up that they weren't ever at the same time, it is a pretty cohesive story in the sense that Rosalie was married to George Calvert. George Calvert owns Adam Francis Plummer, who brings him to Riversdale at 10 years old to be the personal servant of his own son, Charles Benedict. Then Charles Benedict is the owner of this property, which includes Adam Francis Plummer. So this storyline continues throughout in the sense that we are following daybook entries. For one very small example, we knew that there was newspaper articles about an enslaved man named Tom who was killed in a railway accident. This is, I'm not going to get the time, it's sometime in the 1850s, I believe. And he was killed in a railway accident coming back from market with an enslaved woman whose name we don't know. We do not know if she was enslaved at Riversdale as well, but we know that this man Tom was. We then are able to piece together using these newspaper articles, Charles Benedict Calvert's daybooks that mentions Tom was killed this day in accident, as well as then lining that up with Adam Francis Plummer's diary as the enslaved man living in this community. He writes Thomas Lee and his death date, not just that he died by a railway or anything like that. And so just that death date alone allows us to line up. Now we have a first name and a last name. And this is one individual. So like I mentioned, in 1850, the slave schedule says that there's an ownership of 55 men, women, and children. So of those 55, there are some that pass away. There are some that are born between, 1801 to 1864. It is very much a changing tide. And while we hear of Betsy in one year, we don't know if the Betsy 20 years later is the same one, or her daughter, who's also named Betsy. So it's quite complicated, as you can imagine, but we are doing our due diligence to keep those, to try to name them and discover who they are throughout the entirety of our interpretation. And Maya, I'll let you answer Carter's question, but the question about where did the Plumbers live after the Civil War. So Adam Francis Plummer in 1864 was emancipated, which was November 1st, was Maryland's emancipation. And his family members are able to come back, all but one, under one roof, until one of his sons goes down to New Orleans and is able to retrieve his daughter, who was sold into slavery down in New Orleans, in Louisiana, brings her back. So just several years after emancipation, they are all living under one roof, and they, using Adam Francis Plummer's funds that he has saved for years and years, his funds now as a foreman, as well as all of the children who are able to work their funds as well, pulled together and purchased for $1,000 a section of land that is adjoining Riversdale. So he then owns property, which is present-day Edmonston, if anybody's familiar with that specific area. Yeah, so he's one of the first homeowners in Edmonston area, to say that broadly. But he then builds his own log cabin, and by 1870, he and his family are living in this log cabin right on the other side of the Riversdale boundary, and they then continue to build houses, and their sons and daughters and their family live in this section probably through at least to the 1920s, possibly to the 1930s and early 1940s is when we think. So that is where they live.
Yeah. And before I respond to Carter's question in the chat, I saw that Miss Marianne Hakes had her hand up, and I just wanted to let her.
Maya, I just wanted to thank you for this. It was fascinating. And I don't know how many other places have done this, but the parallel stories that's just wonderful how you have done that. It gives us certainly a better understanding of the times. And I just personally wanted to say what a gem Riversdale is. My husband and I had our 50th wedding anniversary there. We've been to zillions of things there. I love the jazz on the lawn in the summer, all the stuff you do. It's really a jewel. And I just wanted to mention, because I was just there the other day, the graveyard of the Calvert graveyard that's off the Riverdale marketplace area.
Yes.
It's just beautiful. The garden club over the past years has just, I'm not a member, but they have really
They've done an amazing
fabulous job.
They have.
It's just
Beth
lovely.
Alvarez has been awesome, and
Yeah.
wonderful thing is that she does keep us in the loop, and occasionally, like, she'll come down and she'll volunteer with our garden volunteers as well, and keeping the connection in a way. And we've been trying to think about like how we can help to support their work with the work that we're doing. But it's just all amazing, and it is just around the corner. And like just thinking about like all the legacy places, as Gina has been working really closely with one of our volunteers in regards to Plummer Park, and like how we are going to build out commemoration around that area. And so there's always like all these connections. But I think one of the things I'm most excited about is like we almost are starting to develop a tourism package around this story. And, you see it in places on the Eastern Shore around Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. Well, Adam Francis Plummer is our Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass for Prince George's County, he and his wife and his family. And it's really exciting to see. And they were people. He's a contemporary. He's born just a year after Frederick Douglass. They actually knew each other. Their son, Henry Benton Plummer, is actually promoted to become the first Black Army chaplain through the recommendation of Frederick Douglass. Their daughter, Nellie Plummer, who we shared, actually, when she became a teacher, lived in the house of Douglass's daughter, Rosetta Douglass Spragg, which is a newer research tidbit that we found out. And so it's just always so much to learn. In terms of like other houses doing this, I do believe there's homes. I can't think of one offhand, but I can tell you at least the ones within our site. I'll say this. The historic house museums in PG Parks, we're all dedicated to doing this work. And so that means Darnell's Chance, Marietta House Museum, Montpelier, and Surratt House will all be doing this type of interpretation and overhaul. We have one historic home that's never been open to the public, but that will open centering the African American experience, even though it was traditionally owned by a white slaveholding family, and that's Concord, which is located just off of 214. But in terms of another house that has done this, it's something I've always wanted to do. But I have to say, I have taken small moments of like inspiration from the Owens Thomas House in Savannah, Georgia. And then also too, I would say, is it Magnolia in Charleston, where Joe McGill, who does the Slave Dwelling Project, he works with a lot of historic homes. And he does like the overnight stays to kind of help people understand about like enslaved people being a presence, not just like out here adjacent in this cabin, but like through and through, and that this society is very integrated. But the Owens Thomas House, I was really surprised and very pleased with how intertwined their history was in that home. And then they too, like us, kind of have an adjacent Marquis de Lafayette story. And one of the things that I think is like so unique about the Marquis de Lafayette is his ideals once they change around enslavement. Much like Thomas Jefferson and people at the time, you know, like they're trying to figure out the issue of like, how do you liberate enslaved people and create a quality of life for them? So that, I would say that house in Charleston and also in Savannah, those are two historic homes. I've worked with people at Bel Air at Bowie who have tried to do some things as well. Susan Proctor is over there at Bel Air. And then, you know, like it's baby steps, you know, like that's one thing. The largest house here in the state is the State House. And so like working on like the installation of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman in those spaces. And like, I just went there a few weeks ago. There's like, you know, some work that's going to be coming up. I can't really disclose that yet, but there's going to be some more things. And so I think as someone who's like always worked in the space of like, how do we balance the narrative, whether that's like in the 18th and 19th century with enslavement, or are we thinking like through like women's movements and like the civil rights era? I mean, all the way up into the 80s and the 90s right now, like we just always have a lot of work to do in terms of balancing the narrative. And I imagine that as we are like even more diverse, like communities that are Asian or Latino, Latinx are also going to be having these types of conversations. And so that's one of the other elements that we're bringing in to the work that we're doing, is that we are having a lot of our things translated into Spanish so that Spanish speakers are able to engage with this material as well. We're thinking about accessibility a lot. We have a special programs unit at PG Parks, and thinking about like, you know, if someone's coming with a wheelchair or if they're like vision impaired, there's a number of things that we have to think about as people are coming to our site, and that it's not any one typical visitor. Like we have so many needs to meet, and you know, like this, what we shared today is just one segment.
Yeah, I would just add to that it's embracing the uncomfortable at times, and knowing that that is okay, and that some of this material, a lot of this material that we talk about, especially when it comes to our permanent exhibition that we will be putting up, we're talking about trauma, we're talking about pain and suffering, but we're also talking about triumph and resilience and joy, and that everyone has making sure that we are continuously connecting it to the present, because that is how change happens, and that is how people can connect directly to any part of that story, especially younger people and especially children, to make sure that this idea of empathy is something that can kind of be a common thread throughout. And I think a lot of historic houses are trying to figure out how to do that in a way that we are in a very tricky spot at times of we are educators, we are entertainers, right? We're a bit of the entertainment industry. And it's at times challenging to combine both of them. But as historians, I think we know that we have to keep going with this. We have to keep pushing forward.
Yeah. And the other houses that I'll say are doing this work are Hampton Mansion in Towson and then Arlington House, because I know the principal investigator for both of those projects. And I think they're really going to be doing some upcoming really interesting things. I went to Tudor Place too this year, and they're doing an amazing job. They even have like portraits of descendants on display as a part of their interpretation. And so it's really neat to see how it shows up in a variety of different ways. And I think what you asked, Marianne, really leans into what Carter Ross is also asking about the changing nature of interpreting historic sites like Riversdale, and how narratives of a range of people are coming out. Can you talk a bit more about how museums and historic sites are approaching this important task and what challenges are being faced? I think we're facing it in a variety of different ways. I think one of the biggest challenges is like location. It depends on where you are. And we are very fortunate to be here in Maryland, and I think we are a state that has, at times, not always, but is more resilient in terms of being open to listening and learning about other experiences in recent years. And when I say recent, I would say maybe the last 15 to 20 years. And I think too, the biggest challenges, of course, are like education and lived experience. And understanding. And so we are all educated in different systems. We all have a different lived experience. I'm someone who is descended from enslaved people. And so it was very important for my family growing up. I always tell people the house I live in, it was my great grandmother's house. And when she had this house, it looked very different than how I have it now. But the one thing that was common is that she kept a copy of Roots on her coffee table. I still have that copy of Roots. And like growing up with that copy of Roots in my house, it centered me in genealogy on some level. Like it just always made me interested. And then I was educated in Washington, D.C. at a time when the city is largely African-American, and there is no challenge in the school educational system to teach African-American history, because the people who work for the Board of Education in the city, of course, would have been a very diverse group of people. And so I think it's just a little bit of patience in the process, and then always being in an exchange of conversation and not shutting down. And even I say that like in two ways. Like Gina knows, this wasn't an easy process for us. Like we've been telling our story for the same way for 30 years. And as you have a lot of people, stakeholders involved, community members who've been coming to Riversdale for years, a change can sometimes be jolting, and it's not always easy. And so what we've tried to do is, as we think about our volunteers, Gina has worked with our volunteer coordinator quite extensively to make sure that our volunteers are trained and brought up to speed with the educational materials that they need. And this is something that just doesn't end. And that as we're doing it, we're showing that it's not like we're lording from above. We let them know, we're happy to be educated too. Wow, I've had education on 18th and 19th century slavery. There's a lot of things that we are still learning. There's so much to know about it. And so I sit in that space with them, not to say this is something you need to do, but this is something that we are going to do collectively. I think that has been the greatest strategy for us. It's a lot of challenges. And then other challenges too are how do you educate different age groups and generations around these types of changing interpretive narratives? How do you connect with people who don't really have a connection to this history? We have a lot of new immigrants to this country, and they're not all just Latino or Spanish speaking. Like, we have people coming from a variety of different places, from Ethiopia, from Nigeria. There's people coming in, and like, how do you get that buy-in? And then, like, historic house museums have had a reputation as being static, but we really aren't static. Like, we have to be ever changing, like any other museum that's out there. So I'm hoping that answered Carter's questions. And then, just continuing to partner with organizations that are like-minded and want to do that work, and continuing to get trained ourselves and getting the best and next practices is what I like to say. We always talk about best practices, but as soon as you got your best practice, there's a next practice. So that's been important for us.
Right.
I see that Leslie M. says, have you ever tried to link the freed enslaved people to the later residents of Lakeland? We kind of are in that phase a little bit right now, because we do have a connection with the 1856 project at University of Maryland, and the Lakeland community is a part of that. And so Miss Maxine Gross and Miss Violetta Sharps are people that we've been in touch with. And Miss Maxine, she's definitely been very vocal. She's like, girl, we have heard enough about the plumbers. We got to think about everybody else. So we take her to heart with that. And, it just takes time. We are a very small team, and having the resources to do this kind of research, it just takes a lot of time. And so I imagine that, like, this is like my third year at Riversdale, and March will be my fourth. So, like, where we were on year one, we already know so much more. I can't wait to see what it looks like next year and in the next 5, 10, 20 years. And so I'm really excited to see where we go with that. But yes, we are kind of trying to work through that and figure out how we connect with these people. But people from Riversdale are connected in a number of different ways. And we know that through the descendants that are coming from the West Coast, from the Midwest, from places like Boston and New Jersey, and in the South and Mississippi. We've even had descendants that reach out to us from Ireland. So, there's just so much in this, and how we connect. And we know that when a lot of the enslaved individuals left Riversdale, as well as the Calverts, they moved to other places. We see a huge swath of people that end up in DC, which is pretty common in terms of movement following the Civil War, and even just before. So, like, I would not be surprised if there's a Lakeland connection for sure. And then Lisa, I see your question here, and then I see you have your hand raised. It says, after emancipation, did residents of Riversdale move to either North Brentwood or Lakeland? And Brentwood for sure, North Brentwood for sure. We do see some people. I can't remember if it was the Kents or the Scots that we saw living in that area, but we do have families that were over in that area. And we were able to kind of get that because there's a cemetery, the Cherry Hill Cemetery, where it's believed that one of the people who was enslaved at our site might have formed the Cherry Hill Cemetery, which is an African-American family cemetery. And in it, I started to do some newspaper research into different people just to try to see if they were connected and buried there. And like, it gave indication that they had lived in Brentwood in these obituaries that were in the newspaper. So I did see that. And yeah, like, there's a lot of research. It's just, you got to take it and compile it at some point.
Right. I was also curious about whether you have done oral histories with the older plumbers, or have other people done that? I know you just mentioned about the 1856 project, knowing a whole lot about it. But.
Well, prior to my arrival, I know that they had interviewed Reverend Jerome Fowler, who was one of the plumber descendants that was most active with Riversdale. And we actually did a small updated recording with him recently. But it is one of the things that we actually want to do as a project to support our Maryland 250 efforts. And we had a meeting with the team from the Hyattsville Library, the Hyattsville Branch Library, who offered to support us in that. And so we just have to set up a meeting to,
Cool.
work out the logistics on it. So we're really excited. But a video link was just shared with me from a documentary that was on MPT by Julie Shablisky, who I used to work with in the state. She is the state archaeologist and actually told me about this cemetery that the Plummer family that was connected to their family church. And so we just met yesterday, literally, and I'm blown away every day that I meet with somebody and they tell me something I didn't know about this site. Just when you think there's nothing more to learn about Riversdale, there is. But we're trying to figure out, she sent me a link to the videos and figure out like if any of the names that we have in our slave list are also in that burial for their family church, which was the St. Paul's Baptist Church. And that church is now a church that is used by a Hispanic church. So it's still in existence, and it's the building, the structure is still around, but the cemetery, there was a reinterment that happened in 1971 and 72. I knew there was a reinterment, but when I spoke with Julie yesterday, she confirmed it was 71 and 72, and that Reverend Fowler, who I just shared his name, he was there to witness it. And the one thing that he shared was that not all the bodies were successfully moved. And so I don't know, what that means for future like archaeology work, because Julie for years worked for the State Highway Administration, and there's a lot of hard feelings about the State Highway Administration and the disruption to different communities and cemeteries and homes and things like that. So we are in early conversations, but I was really happy to meet with her yesterday.
That's wonderful. I don't know if there are additional questions. I don't see any in the chat. Do any of the folks that are still here have other questions? Thanks, Gina, for putting those links.
Yes, I have Joyce White's website, as well as the links to some Christmas cookies that you guys can make in just a few short weeks. And if you want to have that plum pudding, you have to get on top of that soon too, because that takes a couple weeks.
I'm sorry, Karen Brown also has a question about how many enslaved people were actually hired there after emancipation.
That's going to be something that we have to look at, because our interpretation was initially 1801 to 1821. And as Gina kind of shared in her segment, we are looking at 1801 to 1864. And after our interpretation report, the external audit, like our expectation is to kind of take it up to 1870 so we can cover that Reconstruction period, because we know Adam Francis Plummer, his family, even they were still living at Riversdale, living and working at Riversdale. So that's just, a separate research project that we'll have to get to. And so it's really hard to say right now, but at least at minimum, we know Adam Plummer and his family were still at Riversdale until he purchased land and built his own house in 1870.
I would imagine that graduate students from the University of Maryland and other places could be very helpful to you in doing your research.
Yeah, for sure. And we've had internships for a couple of years to do these types of things. And then we just, for the first time, created new research volunteer opportunities, research and genealogy opportunities, which my assistant director, Kaylee Lockbeam, who's currently out on maternity leave, she'll be back in December, early December, and she's actually going to be helping to lead those efforts with our volunteer coordinator. So, that would be a really cool project to undertake with our volunteers.
We also know from Nellie Plummer's Out of the Depths memoir, using the oral histories and diary of her father, she mentions several families who, and first names and last names, who stick around after emancipation and who are paid. And I think she gives a specific amount of money per family, and how Adam Francis was paid a little bit more because he was foreman So we are definitely trying to follow those lines as well in terms of those families. Many of them you can find in census records by 1870, living in the nearby area. So many more research paths to go down.
That's great. Questions? I'll leave folks to see if there are any last questions. Let me just close up for today. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
And thank you, Lisa. I was just going to say the link that I dropped in, it is a link to Out of the Depths, what Gina just mentioned.
I was just wondering about that. That's great, because I was wondering where I could find it. Our next event for Corridor Conversations will be in January. We don't have a speaker yet, but we hope to have one, and we'll put that information out. I just want to mention that Hyattsville Aging in Place is having its traditional fundraiser at Franklin's Restaurant on December 9th, and from 11 till 9 o'clock. It's a Monday, and Franklin's donates 20% of any receipts that you turn in during that day on food, gifts, and drinks. So just taking a moment to put out that message. I don't know if there are any other questions that have come up, but if not, Karen, you could just unmute your microphone and say this if you want.
I'm tearful. I'm so touched by the depth of your research and your commitment to giving all of this such a important voice, not only to the people today, but to the future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I hope we can come back and check in with you on a regular basis.
Yes, please do. Please do. We would love it.
If there's any time that you want to put some additional information out to the general community, just let us know, and we'll schedule another session. But thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a
Thank
pleasure
you.
meeting you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm. Okay. All right. So thank you very much. I think we'll just close it here, and please go to Riversdale over in December, see what you can see in the dining room for the food, and imagine all of the presentations that will be there ultimately that we've heard about today.